Before Egypt built its pyramids, before Greece had philosophers, before Rome had legions, before India had the Vedas, before China had emperors, there was a land between two rivers, and in that land something happened that changed the world forever. The land was called Mesopotamia, from the Greek words for river and middle, the land in the middle of the rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now Iraq. The rivers rose in the mountains of eastern Turkey and flowed south and southeast for over 1,000 kilometers before reaching the Persian Gulf, crossing in their lower reaches a flat alluvial plain of such extraordinary fertility that later generations would call it the cradle of civilization. The soil deposited by the river's annual floods was among the richest in the world, capable of producing grain yields that would not be surpassed until the agricultural revolution of the 20th century. The climate was hot and dry, but the river water was there, and the people who learned to use it discovered that they were living in one of the most productive agricultural environments on Earth. Subscribe now and never miss a documentary. Every week we travel to the beginnings, to the moments when the world as we know it was first assembled, piece by piece, out of the ideas and the labor of people who had no idea what they were starting. What those people started, beginning approximately 6,000 years ago in the southern portion of the alluvial plain, was nothing less than civilization itself, not in the loose sense in which the word is sometimes used as a synonym for culture or society, but in the specific technical sense that archaeologists and historians have in mind when they use it, a society organized around cities, sustained by surplus agriculture, administered through writing and bureaucracy, governed by law, stratified by class, and capable of producing the division of labor that allows some members of the community to devote themselves full-time to activities other than food production. All of those things, the cities, the writing, the law, the bureaucracy, the division of labor, the stratification, appeared first, or among the first, in Mesopotamia, and they appeared there not as imports from somewhere else but as local inventions, developed by the people of the Tigris-Euphrates plain in response to the specific challenges and opportunities of their environment. The story of Mesopotamia is, in the most literal sense, the story of where we came from. The civilization that flourished between the rivers invented the wheel and the plow, the arch and the dome, the concept of time divided into hours and minutes, the mathematical system based on 60 that still governs our clocks and our geometry, the first written literature, the first written laws, the first astronomical observations systematic enough to constitute a science. It invented the city. It invented writing. It invented, in the most fundamental sense, the modern world. And yet it is less well known than the civilizations that came after it, that inherited its achievements, that built on the foundations it laid. Tonight we go back to the beginning, to the moment when human beings first assembled the world we still inhabit. The obscurity of Mesopotamia in popular consciousness is one of the stranger facts about the history of human civilization. Egypt, its near contemporary and in many respects its cultural heir, is universally recognized and endlessly celebrated. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the pharaohs, Tutankhamun, and yet Egypt's civilization, remarkable as it was, began a full 1,000 years after the Sumerians had already invented writing, developed the first cities, and codified the first laws. Greece, whose philosophers and artists and political theorists are the acknowledged foundations of Western intellectual tradition, inherited from Babylon the astronomical and mathematical frameworks that made Greek science possible, and yet the Babylonian origins of Greek science are rarely mentioned in the standard accounts of Western intellectual history. The invisibility of Mesopotamia in our cultural self-understanding is a measure of how thoroughly its achievements have been absorbed into the background of civilization itself, so fundamental that we no longer notice them, like the air we breathe or the grammar of the language in which we think. Part of what has kept Mesopotamia invisible is simply the difficulty of the evidence. The cuneiform tablets that are the primary source for Mesopotamian history and culture require specialist training to read. The script is complex, the languages are archaic, and the range of material they cover is vast. Unlike the monuments of Egypt or the literary remains of Greece, the Mesopotamian record is not easily accessible to non-specialists. It lives in the storerooms and display cases of museums, in the scholarly journals of Assyriology, in the footnotes of biblical scholarship. But the story it tells, once you know how to read it, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the human species. The people who built the first cities of Mesopotamia were called the Sumerians, and their origins are one of the oldest unsolved puzzles in the history of archaeology. The Sumerians appear in the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia, the region they called Sumer, corresponding roughly to modern southern Iraq, beginning around 5000 BCE, during what archaeologists call the Ubaid period. They were not the first people to inhabit the region. Earlier populations had been farming and herding in Mesopotamia for several thousand years before the Sumerians created urban civilization, but they were the people who made the decisive leap from village to city, from subsistence farming to surplus agriculture, from oral tradition to writing. Where they came from before they appeared in the archaeological record of Sumer is unknown. Their language, Sumerian, is a language isolate, unrelated to any other known language family, which rules out the possibility of identifying their origins by tracing linguistic relatives. They simply appear, fully formed in their cultural complexity, in the archaeological record of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta, and the question of where they came from before that has not been answered. What is clear is what the Sumerians did once they were established in the southern alluvial plain. They transformed the environment. The lower Mesopotamian plain was, in its natural state, a challenging place to farm. The rivers flooded unpredictably, depositing fertile soil but also washing away crops and settlements if the floods were too large. The areas between the rivers were dry desert through most of the year. The water table was high in some areas and low in others. The natural drainage was inadequate to prevent the salinization of the soil that intensive irrigation eventually produces. The Sumerians addressed all of these problems with engineering, with the canals and dikes and reservoirs that transformed the natural flood patterns into a managed irrigation system capable of producing reliable surpluses year after year. The scale of the Sumerian irrigation system was, for its time, one of the most impressive engineering achievements in human history. The main canals were navigable by boat. They served as transportation arteries as well as water supply channels, connecting the urban centers with the agricultural hinterland and with each other. The secondary and tertiary channels distributed water to individual fields with a regularity and a precision that required systematic maintenance and the coordination of labor across many individual farming households. The dikes that protected the cities and the fields from the annual floods required construction and maintenance by hundreds or thousands of workers, organized and directed by an administrative authority capable of planning and executing large-scale labor projects. Irrigation agriculture, in other words, demanded the kind of organized social complexity that we call civilization, and in demanding it, it produced it, or at least, it created the conditions under which civilization could emerge. The relationship between environment and civilization is one of the oldest questions in the history of social thought, and Mesopotamia is the paradigm case for thinking about it. The Greek geographer Strabo and the Arab historian Ibn Khaldun both noted the extraordinary fertility of the Mesopotamian plain and connected it to the sophistication of the civilizations that had flourished there. The 19th century school of environmental determinism, associated with scholars like Karl Wittfogel, who argued that irrigation agriculture necessarily produces despotic government because the need to control the water supply concentrates power in a single authority, used Mesopotamia as its primary example. More recent scholarship has complicated this picture considerably. The archaeological and textual evidence from Mesopotamia suggests that the development of centralized authority was a gradual and contested process, not the inevitable consequence of irrigation technology, and that the relationship between water management and political power was more reciprocal and more variable than the deterministic model suggests. But the underlying insight, that the specific demands of irrigation agriculture in the Tigris-Euphrates Delta created pressures towards social organization that would not have existed in other environments, remains valid and important. The specific technologies that the Sumerians developed to manage the river environment were not merely practical. They also shaped the social and intellectual life of the civilization in profound ways. The need to predict the annual floods, to plan the planting and harvest cycle, to coordinate the maintenance of the canal system. All of these demanded systematic observation of the natural world, careful record-keeping, and mathematical calculation. The astronomical and mathematical traditions for which Babylon would eventually become famous did not spring from nowhere. They grew from the practical demands of an agricultural civilization that needed to know, with precision, when to plant, when the flood would come, and how to calculate the areas of the fields and the quantities of grain they would produce. The intellectual achievements of Mesopotamia were rooted in the mud of the alluvial plain, in the daily practical challenges of making the land between the rivers produce enough food to sustain an urban civilization. The first cities of Mesopotamia were not merely large villages. They were qualitatively different kinds of human settlements, places organized around institutions, sustained by surplus, and structured by social hierarchies that did not exist in the pre-urban world. The most important of the early Sumerian cities was Uruk, located on the Euphrates in what is now southern Iraq. At its height, around 3100 BCE, Uruk was home to perhaps 50,000 people, making it by far the largest settlement that had ever existed anywhere on Earth, at a time when most of the world's population still lived in communities of a few hundred. The city covered approximately 6 square kilometers, and its center was dominated by a complex of monumental religious buildings, temples and ziggurats, that required the organized labor of thousands of workers and the administrative capacity to plan and sustain construction projects over many years. Uruk was not just a large settlement. It was a new kind of thing. A city with all the social complexity and institutional elaboration that the word implies. The Uruk period, the 4 centuries between approximately 3500 and 3100 BCE, during which the city of Uruk reached its maximum size and influence, was the crucible in which the essential institutions of Mesopotamian civilization were forged. Writing was invented in Uruk, or at least the earliest known writing was found there. Thousands of clay tablets bearing pictographic symbols that record the quantities of various commodities, grain, cattle, fish, cloth, received and distributed by the great temple and palace institutions at the heart of the city. The earliest writing was not literature or law or religion. It was accounting, the administrative tool of an institution that needed to track the movement of large quantities of goods through a complex redistributive economy. The invention of writing was, in the most literal sense, an invention driven by the practical demands of urban administration. The city's social structure reflected the demands of the administrative and economic system that sustained it. At the top was the En, the ruler, who combined the roles of high priest, military commander, and chief administrator, and around him was an elite of priests, officials, and skilled craftsmen who managed the city's institutions. Below them was the mass of free citizens, farmers, artisans, merchants, laborers, who owed taxes and labor service to the institutions but who owned property, could enter into contracts, and had rights recognized by the developing legal tradition. At the bottom were the enslaved, war captives, debt slaves, and the destitute, who had no rights and whose labor was the foundation of many of the city's most demanding activities. This social hierarchy, elite, citizens, enslaved, was the template on which every subsequent urban civilization in the Old World was built, and it originated in Uruk 5,000 years ago. The physical infrastructure of Uruk and its successor cities reveals the material expression of this social hierarchy. The great temples, the White Temple of Anu on its massive mud brick platform, the Eanna precinct of Inanna with its elaborate courts and columned halls, were built on a scale that demanded the mobilization of thousands of workers over years. The techniques used in their construction were themselves innovations, The Sumerians developed the fired brick, which could withstand the seasonal flooding that dissolved sun-dried mud brick, and the architectural forms, the arch, the vault, the dome, that allowed the spanning of large interior spaces. The ziggurat, the stepped tower that became the most distinctive architectural form of Mesopotamian civilization, was not merely a religious structure. It was a statement of power, visible from kilometers away across the flat alluvial plain, proclaiming the wealth and the organizational capacity of the city that had built it. The daily life of Uruk's population was organized around the institutions of the temple and palace in ways that left every individual in a relationship of dependency and obligation to the great institutions. The temple owned perhaps a third of the agricultural land in the city's territory and employed a substantial fraction of the city's non-agricultural population as laborers, craftsmen, and administrators. The labor obligations of free citizens, the corvée labor owed to the city for construction, maintenance, and military service, structured the rhythms of daily life in ways that left little room for purely private activity. And yet within this framework of institutional dependency, individuals maintained private lives of considerable complexity. Owning property, conducting business, entering into marriages and divorces, going to court, writing letters, making music, drinking beer in the taverns that are one of the more charming features of the Mesopotamian urban landscape documented in the archaeological and textual record. The invention of writing is the most consequential single achievement in the history of human civilization, and it happened in Mesopotamia. Not in the sense that writing was invented only once and only there. There is credible evidence for independent invention of writing in China around 1200 BCE, and possibly in Mesoamerica around 900 BCE. But the oldest confirmed writing system in the world is the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia, which developed from the pictographic accounting notation of the Uruk period into a full writing system capable of representing any statement in the Sumerian and later the Akkadian languages, and which was used continuously for 3,000 years before it was abandoned in favor of the alphabetic scripts derived from Phoenician. 3,000 years is a period longer than the entire history of alphabetic writing, longer than the period from the earliest Greek inscriptions to the present. The cuneiform tradition is one of the longest continuously maintained writing traditions in human history, and it began in Uruk. The development from accounting notation to full writing took several centuries and passed through several stages. The earliest tablets, dating to around 3100 BCE, contain only numbers and logograms, symbols that represent specific commodities or concepts that could record economic transactions but could not represent spoken language. By approximately 2800 BCE, scribes had developed a system of phonetic complements, symbols used not for their meaning but for their sound, that allowed the notation of proper names and other items that could not be represented by logograms alone. By approximately 2600 BCE, a full phonetic system existed that could represent any element of the Sumerian language, and the range of texts that could be produced expanded dramatically. Administrative records, legal documents, royal inscriptions, and eventually the literary and religious texts that represent some of the earliest examples of written literature in the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of the legendary king of Uruk, his friendship with the wild man Enkidu, their heroic adventures, and Gilgamesh's quest for immortality after Enkidu's death, is the oldest substantial work of literature in human history. It was composed in Sumerian and Akkadian versions over a period of roughly 1,500 years, from approximately 2100 BCE to approximately 600 BCE, and it was preserved on clay tablets in libraries across Mesopotamia. When the tablets were discovered in the 19th century and deciphered by Victorian scholars, the discovery that the story contained a flood narrative that closely paralleled the biblical story of Noah caused a sensation that reverberated through the religious and intellectual life of the period. The Mesopotamian flood story predated the biblical one by at least 1,000 years, and it told the same story in most of its essential details, raising uncomfortable questions about the relationship between divine revelation and human literary tradition that have not been fully resolved to this day. The Epic of Gilgamesh is remarkable not only for its antiquity but for its intellectual and emotional sophistication. The story's central theme, the confrontation with mortality and the search for a way to overcome it, is as relevant today as it was 4,000 years ago. Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk, is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, and his journey begins with the death of his beloved companion Enkidu, the wild man who had been his equal in strength and his opposite in nature. Gilgamesh's grief at Enkidu's death is portrayed with a psychological depth that is startling in a text of this antiquity. He refuses to accept the death, refuses to allow the burial for days, sitting with the body until worms emerge. His subsequent quest for immortality, for the plant at the bottom of the sea that restores youth, ends in failure and in the wisdom that human beings cannot achieve immortality, that the proper response to mortality is to live well and to embrace what the present offers. This is not a consoling philosophy, and the epic does not pretend it is. It is an honest engagement with one of the most difficult facts of human existence, and it was composed in Mesopotamia 3,000 to 4,000 years before the philosophical traditions that we usually associate with this kind of inquiry had come into existence. The written tradition that the Gilgamesh epic represents was sustained by a dedicated professional class, the scribes, whose training was one of the most demanding in the ancient world. The scribal schools, called Idaba in Sumerian, trained students in the mastery of cuneiform script, the Sumerian and Akkadian languages, mathematics, music, and the literary canon of Mesopotamian culture. The curriculum included the copying of standard texts, administrative formulae, lexical lists, literary classics, as well as original composition. The tablets recovered from the Idaba at Nippur include not only student exercises but also a body of Sumerian literature describing the life of the school, including detailed accounts of the punishments inflicted on students who were late or inattentive, that are among the most vivid glimpses of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. The great lawgivers of the ancient world, Moses, Solon, Lycurgus, Manu, are celebrated in the traditions of their respective civilizations as the originators of the legal frameworks that organized their societies. All of them came after Hammurabi, the Babylonian king who in approximately 1754 BCE promulgated the most famous law code of the ancient world, and all of them may have been influenced, directly or indirectly, by the legal tradition that Hammurabi was himself inheriting and codifying from Sumerian predecessors who had been writing laws for 1,000 years before him. The Code of Hammurabi was not the first written law code. It was preceded by the Code of Ur-Nammu, composed in Sumerian approximately 300 years earlier, and possibly by earlier Sumerian legal texts that have not survived. But it was the most comprehensive, the most ambitious, and the most influential. The code is preserved on a black basalt stele approximately 2 meters tall, discovered at Susa in modern Iran in 1901 and now housed in the Louvre. The top of the stele shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, the divine sanction that gave the code its authority, and below is inscribed the text of 282 laws covering an enormous range of subjects: contracts, property rights, family law, inheritance, wages, prices, professional liability, criminal punishment, and the rights of slaves. The code is explicit about the principle that the laws apply differently to different social classes. The famous principle of Talion, an eye for an eye, applies between equals, but the punishment for injuring a social superior is more severe than for injuring an inferior. The law is not equal, but it is written down, which means that it can be known and appealed to, and that the ruler's arbitrary power is at least partially constrained by the existence of a public standard. The significance of this, of having laws written down and publicly displayed, cannot be overstated. Before written law, the only constraint on the behavior of the powerful was custom and the threat of resistance. Written law created something new, a standard that could in principle be applied consistently, that could be appealed to by anyone who could read it or have it read to them, that could be cited in a dispute as the basis for a claim. The stele of Hammurabi was not placed in a palace, it was set up in public, where anyone could read it. The statement at the end of the code is explicit. Any man who suffers an injustice can read the words of the law and understand what he is entitled to. This is not democracy. The laws are the king's laws, and they are applied by the king's agents, but it is the beginning of something that would eventually become the rule of law, one of the most important concepts in the history of human civilization. The specific provisions of the Code of Hammurabi reveal a great deal about the society it was designed to regulate. The code distinguishes between three social classes: the awilum, the free citizen; the mushkanim, a semi-free person of uncertain status; and the wardum, the slave, and applies different standards of punishment and compensation depending on which class the parties to a dispute belong to. The penalties for physical injury vary by class. If an awilum puts out the eye of another awilum, his eye is put out. If he puts out the eye of a mushkanim, he pays a fine. If he puts out the eye of a wardum, he pays half the slave's value to the slave's owner. This is not equality before the law, and it is not intended to be. It is a codification of existing social hierarchy, an attempt to regularize the relationships between different social classes rather than to equalize them. But the code also contains protections for the weak against the strong that are genuinely remarkable for their time. The code protects debtors against creditors who seize their property illegally. It establishes maximum prices for various goods and services, limiting the ability of merchants to exploit shortage conditions. It requires that temples provide food and support to the destitute. It gives women property rights, the right to own businesses, and legal standing in court. It protects children from arbitrary disinheritance. The legal tradition that Hammurabi was codifying and extending, a tradition that went back at least 3 centuries to the earlier Sumerian law codes, was genuinely concerned with the protection of the vulnerable as well as the regulation of the powerful. And this concern for justice that transcends mere power is one of the most important contributions of the Mesopotamian legal tradition to the subsequent history of human civilization. The Mesopotamian legal system was administered through a court system that included both royal courts and temple courts, with the ability to appeal from lower to higher courts and ultimately to the king himself. Legal proceedings were recorded on tablets. The case, the testimony of witnesses, the decision of the court, and the penalties or compensations ordered, in a way that created a body of case law that accumulated over centuries and that allowed the development of legal precedent in a manner not entirely different from the common law tradition. The Mesopotamian legal archives are among the most important sources for understanding the daily life of ancient Mesopotamia because they record real disputes between real people over real property, rights, and relationships, the raw material of social life preserved in the record of its conflicts and their resolution. The cities of ancient Mesopotamia were not merely administrative centers and religious complexes. They were also the first great commercial hubs in the world, places where trade was conducted at a scale and with a sophistication that no previous human society had achieved. The Mesopotamian economy was, by the standards of its time, extraordinarily complex. The great temple and palace institutions at the heart of each city functioned as both religious establishments and economic enterprises. They owned land, operated workshops, employed craftsmen and laborers, issued loans, and conducted long-distance trade. The Temple of Inanna at Uruk, which dominated the city in the 3rd millennium BCE, was not merely a place of worship. It was the largest single employer and property owner in the city, the institution that coordinated the allocation of agricultural land, that stored and redistributed the surplus grain that sustained the non-agricultural population, and that organized the expeditions that brought raw materials, copper, tin, silver, lapis lazuli, cedar wood, from the distant regions where they could be found. The long-distance trade networks of ancient Mesopotamia were one of its most remarkable achievements. Southern Mesopotamia is almost entirely lacking in the raw materials that urban civilization requires. There is no stone for building, no timber for construction or fuel, no metal ores, and the most valued luxury materials, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, cedar from Lebanon, obsidian from Anatolia, are all from sources hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. The Mesopotamians solved this problem through trade, through the systematic exchange of their agricultural surpluses and manufactured goods for the raw materials they needed. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian merchants were conducting regular trade with the Indus Valley civilization to the east, with the Gulf Coast and the Arabian Peninsula to the south, with Anatolia and the Levant to the north and west, and with Egypt across the Sinai. The commercial networks they developed were the first truly long-distance trade systems in the world, and they laid the foundations for the interconnected global economy that is still developing today. The institution of credit, the ability to borrow money or goods with the expectation of repaying them later with interest, was also developed in Mesopotamia, several millennia before it appeared anywhere else in the world. The temple archives of Nippur and other Mesopotamian cities are full of loan documents. Tablets recording the terms under which grain or silver was borrowed, the interest rate to be charged, the date of repayment, and the witnesses to the transaction. Some of these loan documents date to the 3rd millennium BCE, making Mesopotamian credit markets among the oldest financial institutions in human history. The concept of interest, of compensation for the use of capital over time, and the mathematical tools needed to calculate it were developed in Mesopotamia, and they underlie every financial system that has existed since. The standardization of weights and measures, one of the most fundamental preconditions of a commercial economy, was also a Mesopotamian achievement. The shekel, the mina, and the talent were units of weight used across the ancient Near East for thousands of years, and their origins were in the Mesopotamian administrative system of the 3rd millennium BCE. The cubit, the standard unit of length used in construction across the ancient Near East, including in the construction of the biblical ark, whose dimensions are given in cubits, was a Mesopotamian unit of measurement. The standardization of these measures across a large geographic area was not automatic or effortless. It required the authority of the great institutions, the temples and palaces that set the standards and enforced them through their control of commercial transactions, and it was one of the most important institutional achievements of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The Mesopotamian merchant class, the Tam-Karam in Akkadian, was one of the most important social institutions of ancient Mesopotamia, and the legal and administrative framework that governed commercial activity was as sophisticated as anything in the pre-modern world. Merchants operated as agents of the great temple and palace institutions, conducting long-distance trade on their behalf and taking a share of the profits in return. But they also conducted private trade on their own account, using the networks and the infrastructure that the institutional trade had created. The distinction between institutional and private commercial activity was not always clear, and the legal cases recorded on tablets from commercial centers like Nippur and Ur frequently involved disputes about the respective claims of institutions and individuals to the profits of trading ventures. The use of silver as a medium of exchange, the first money in the historical sense, was also a Mesopotamian invention. Silver was weighed in standard units, the shekel and its multiples, and used to denominate prices, wages, rents, and debts in the administrative and legal records. This was not coinage. The use of minted coins as a medium of exchange was invented much later, probably in Lydia in the 7th century BCE, but it was money in the functional sense, a standard unit of value that could be used to make transactions without direct barter. The development of money allowed the Mesopotamian economy to achieve a level of complexity and specialization that barter economies could not support, and it is one of the most consequential economic innovations in human history. The astronomical knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia was among the most sophisticated in the pre-modern world, and its legacy is still present in the way we measure time and organize the sky. The Babylonian astronomers, who were also priests, working from the great ziggurats that served simultaneously as temples and observatories, observed the sky with a systematic regularity and a mathematical precision that was not matched in the Western world until the early modern period. They tracked the movements of the planets across the zodiac, identified the relationships between planetary cycles, and developed the mathematical tools to predict celestial events, eclipses, planetary conjunctions, the rising and setting of Venus, with an accuracy that is still impressive when measured against modern calculations. The Babylonian astronomical tablets known as the Mul.Apin, composed in the 2nd millennium BCE but recording observations that extend back much further, represent one of the most comprehensive astronomical databases of the ancient world. The Mesopotamians divided the sky into the 12 constellations of the zodiac, a conceptual framework that is still in use today in Western and South Asian astronomy and astrology. They divided the year into 12 months, the day into 24 hours, the hour into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds. All numerical divisions that reflect the Mesopotamian preference for the base 60 number system, which they had developed for its mathematical advantages. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it far more convenient for calculations involving fractions than the base 10 system that we use for most purposes. When you look at the time on your phone and see that it is, say, 7:43 in the evening, you are using a system of time measurement invented by Babylonian astronomers 4,000 years ago. The Babylonian astronomical tradition was sustained by an unbroken chain of observation and calculation spanning more than 2,000 years, from the earliest systematic records of the 2nd millennium BCE to the latest cuneiform astronomical tablets of the 1st century CE. This is one of the longest continuously maintained scientific traditions in human history, and the database of astronomical observations it accumulated was unique in the ancient world for its combination of precision, continuity, and mathematical sophistication. The Babylonian astronomers did not merely observe, they developed mathematical models capable of predicting future celestial events. They identified the periodic cycles underlying the apparent motions of the planets, and they used those cycles to calculate planetary positions in advance with an accuracy that modern astronomers have verified against independent calculations. The Babylonian system of mathematical astronomy was transmitted to the Greeks through a chain of cultural transmission that is still being traced by historians of science. Hipparchus, the Greek astronomer of the 2nd century BCE who is credited with discovering the precession of the equinoxes, used Babylonian eclipse records going back several centuries to detect the slow shift in the apparent positions of the stars. Ptolemy, the Egyptian astronomer of the 2nd century CE whose Almagest was the definitive work of ancient astronomy, drew extensively on Babylonian period relations for his models of planetary motion. The zodiacal constellations that were the framework for both Babylonian and Greek astronomy, and that survive today in the Western astrological tradition and in the astronomical coordinate system still used by professional astronomers, were defined by Babylonian astronomers in the 1st millennium BCE. The mathematical tools developed for astronomical calculation were also applied to other problems in Mesopotamian intellectual life. The concept of algebraic problem solving, of setting up and solving equations, appears in Mesopotamian mathematical tablets in the 2nd millennium BCE, more than 1,000 years before Greek algebra. The Babylonian treatment of what we call quadratic equations, preserved on tablets like the one known as YBC 7289, demonstrates a systematic and generalizable approach to algebraic problem solving that was not matched in European mathematics until the medieval period. The mathematical achievements of ancient Mesopotamia extended far beyond astronomy. The Mesopotamians developed the first place value number system, a system in which the position of a digit in a number determines its value, making large number calculations possible in a way that additive systems like Roman numerals cannot manage. They knew what we call the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born, and the tablet known as Plimpton 322, dated to approximately 1800 BCE, contains a table of Pythagorean triples, sets of integers that satisfy the relationship a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That demonstrates a systematic mathematical knowledge of this relationship far in advance of any Greek equivalent. They developed algorithms for calculating square roots, cube roots, and the areas of various geometric shapes. The mathematics of ancient Mesopotamia was not primitive or intuitive. It was systematic, rigorous, and capable of solving problems of considerable complexity. The religious life of ancient Mesopotamia was as complex and sophisticated as its legal, commercial, and mathematical traditions, and it shaped the religious traditions of the world in ways that are still being debated by historians of religion. The Mesopotamian pantheon was large and hierarchically organized, with a structure that reflected the political organization of Mesopotamian society. At the top were the great gods, An, the sky god, Enlil, the god of wind and storms and the most powerful of the gods, Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, and Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the goddess of love, fertility, and warfare. These great gods were the divine equivalents of the great rulers, powerful, capricious, demanding of worship and obedience, capable of both beneficence and terrible destruction. Below them were lesser gods, each associated with specific cities, crafts, or natural phenomena, and below them were the demons and supernatural beings that populated the lower realms of the Mesopotamian cosmos. The relationship between the Mesopotamian gods and human beings was explicitly contractual. The gods had created humans to serve them, to build their temples, to grow their food, and to perform the rituals that sustained their divine lives. In return, the gods provided fertility, protection, and the order that made civilization possible. When the gods were properly served, the world went well. When they were neglected or angered, disaster followed. The great myths of Mesopotamia, the Enuma Elish, the creation epic that describes the origins of the world, the story of Adapa, who lost the opportunity for immortality through misunderstanding, the flood narrative preserved in the Gilgamesh epic and in the separate Atrahasis myth, all explore the relationship between human beings and their gods, the origins of human mortality, and the problem of why the world contains so much suffering and injustice. The flood narrative deserves particular attention because of its extraordinary cultural influence. The Mesopotamian flood story, in which the gods decide to destroy humanity with a great flood, but one favored human is warned by the god Enki, builds a large boat, saves his family and pairs of all living creatures, and survives the flood to repopulate the earth, is almost certainly the source of the biblical flood narrative in Genesis. The parallels are too specific to be coincidental. The same basic plot, the same divine warning, the same boat, the same release of birds to test whether land has emerged, the same divine covenant after the flood. The Mesopotamian stories are older. The Atrahasis myth dates to approximately 1700 BCE, and the flood narrative in the Gilgamesh epic is approximately the same age, and the Hebrew scriptures show clear signs of Mesopotamian cultural influence in many other places. The story of Noah is, in one of the most important senses, a Mesopotamian story, retold and reinterpreted within a different theological framework. The Mesopotamian religious tradition was also the source of several other cultural and symbolic frameworks that shaped subsequent traditions across the ancient Near East. The concept of the divine council, of a gathering of gods who debate and decide the fate of the world, appears in Mesopotamian texts from the earliest periods and recurs in the Hebrew Bible, where it has been identified as a background element in several texts that refer to God consulting with other divine beings. The figure of the dying and rising God, associated in Mesopotamia primarily with the god Dumuzi, the shepherd who dies each year and is mourned by his consort Inanna before his resurrection, has been connected by scholars to the dying and rising figures of other ancient Near Eastern religions, including the figure of Osiris in Egypt and the figure of Baal in Canaan. The connections are contested, and the direct lines of transmission are not always clear, but the Mesopotamian tradition stands at the beginning of a network of cultural influence that shaped the religious landscape of the ancient world for 3,000 years. The temple prostitution that 19th-century scholars attributed to the temples of Ishtar in Babylon, based on a passage in Herodotus describing women who sat in the temple waiting to be approached by strangers, has been largely abandoned by modern scholarship as a misreading of the evidence. But the temples of the major Mesopotamian goddesses, particularly Inanna Ishtar, were genuine centers of a complex religious and social institution involving ritual specialists, musicians, and performers of various kinds, and the hymns composed in honor of Inanna by the Akkadian princess Enheduanna, who served as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur around 2300 BCE, are the first known literary works attributed to a named author in human history. Enheduanna, the daughter of the first great Mesopotamian emperor Sargon of Akkad, wrote hymns of remarkable sophistication and emotional depth, including a personal lament in which she describes her exile from the temple by a political enemy and her appeal to the goddess for restoration. She is the world's first known poet, and she was a Mesopotamian woman writing in Sumerian 23 centuries before the birth of Christ. The rise of Babylon, the city that would eventually become the most famous in the ancient world, the symbol of urban grandeur and excess, the city whose name became a word for everything magnificent and everything corrupt, was one of the most dramatic political and cultural transformations in the history of Mesopotamia. Babylon was not always the dominant city of Mesopotamia. For the first millennium of Mesopotamian urban history, the great cities were in the south: Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, and Babylon was a minor settlement in the middle of the alluvial plain, unremarkable except for its location at a natural crossing point of the Euphrates. It was only with the rise of the Amorite dynasty at the beginning of the second millennium BCE, culminating in the reign of Hammurabi, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE, that Babylon became the dominant political and cultural center of Mesopotamia. Under Hammurabi and his successors, Babylon brought most of the alluvial plain under its control, developed the legal and administrative traditions that Hammurabi's code represents, and established the cultural prestige that would make Babylonian language, literature, and learning the common currency of the educated elite across the ancient Near East for the next 2 millennia. The Babylonian Empire went through multiple cycles of expansion and contraction, destruction and rebuilding, that mirror the turbulent political history of the ancient Near East more broadly. It was destroyed by the Hittites around 1595 BCE, fell under the control of the Kassite dynasty from the mountains to the east, was devastated by the Assyrians in 689 BCE when the Assyrian king Sennacherib demolished the city and diverted a canal over its ruins in an act of deliberate cultural erasure, was rebuilt by Sennacherib's successors, and reached its greatest physical extent and cultural achievement under the Neo-Babylonian dynasty of the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the dynasty of Nebuchadnezzar II, who built the famous Hanging Gardens and the great processional way that the Bible calls the Street of Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian period produced some of the most impressive urban architecture of the ancient world. The city at its height covered approximately 800 hectares and was surrounded by massive double walls that the Greek historian Herodotus described as wide enough at the top for a 4-horse chariot to turn around on. The great ziggurat of Babylon, the Etemenanke, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose approximately 90 meters above the plain, tall enough to be visible for kilometers in every direction. It was almost certainly the inspiration for the Tower of Babel in the Book of Genesis, which describes a tower reaching toward heaven built by the survivors of the Great Flood. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, are described by classical sources as a tiered structure of irrigated gardens, though their exact nature and location remain debated by archaeologists who have not found definitive physical evidence for them at the excavated site of Babylon. The Ishtar Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the inner city of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II, is one of the most spectacular surviving examples of ancient Near Eastern art and architecture. The gate was constructed of fired brick glazed in deep blue, with alternating rows of the dragon of Marduk and the bull of Adad in yellow and white relief against the blue background. The entire processional way leading to the gate was lined with similar glazed brick walls decorated with lions, the symbol of the goddess Ishtar. The original gate was dismantled by German archaeologists in the early 20th century and reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, where it remains one of the most visited objects in European museum collections. It is a physical embodiment of the architectural ambition and the technical achievement of Neo-Babylonian civilization at its height. The Babylonian exile, the deportation of the Judean elite to Babylon following Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem in 597 and 586 BCE, was one of the most consequential events in the history of the Hebrew Bible. The exiles who lived in Babylon for several decades before the Persian conquest allowed their return were exposed directly to the full force of Babylonian culture. Its literature, its religious traditions, its cosmological frameworks, its architectural grandeur. The encounter between Israelite religion and Babylonian civilization during the exile was a transformative one that shaped the final form of many biblical texts, including the creation narrative in Genesis, the flood story, and possibly the Book of Job. The Babylonian captivity is, in this sense, not merely a political event in the history of ancient Israel. It is a cultural event of world historical significance, the moment when two of the most important religious and literary traditions of the ancient world encountered each other directly. The figure of Nebuchadnezzar II, who destroyed Jerusalem, deported the Judean elite, and built the greatest city of the ancient world, is one of the most complex in the history of the ancient Near East. In the Hebrew Bible, he is the agent of divine punishment. In Babylonian sources, he is a great builder and administrator who maintained the religious traditions of his predecessors with impressive devotion. Both portraits are accurate. He was genuinely a great king by the standards of his time, and genuinely responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem. The moral complexity of a figure who is simultaneously great builder and destroyer of peoples is captured by the ancient sources, each in their own framework, with more sophistication than modern popular accounts usually acknowledge. The relationship between ancient Mesopotamia and the biblical tradition is one of the most fascinating and most controversial threads in the history of ancient civilization, and it has been a source of scholarly and religious debate since the decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 1850s and 1860s, achieved primarily through the work of the British officer Henry Rawlinson, who copied and translated the trilingual Behistun inscription in Iran, and the British Museum scholar George Smith, who identified the Mesopotamian flood narrative on a tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal, was one of the most dramatic intellectual events of the Victorian period. The discovery that the flood story, one of the most distinctive and most emotionally significant narratives in the Hebrew Bible, had a Mesopotamian precedent that was in many ways more detailed and more specific than the biblical version, caused a sensation that reverberated through Victorian religious culture. If the story of Noah came from Babylonian mythology, what did that mean for the divine inspiration of the scriptures? The question has been debated by theologians and scholars ever since, and it has not been definitively resolved. The flood story is only the most dramatic of many parallels between Mesopotamian and biblical literature. The creation narrative in Genesis, with its division of the primordial waters into the waters above and below the firmament, echoes the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, in which the god Marduk divides the body of the slain goddess Tiamat, the primordial ocean, into the sky and the earth. The story of Moses being found in a basket in the river has a parallel in the Akkadian legend of Sargon of Akkad, whose mother placed him in a basket and set it afloat on a river when he was an infant. The wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible, the Book of Proverbs, the Book of Job, has parallels in Mesopotamian wisdom literature that predate it by centuries. The similarities are too numerous and too specific to be coincidental, and the most widely accepted explanation among scholars is that the Hebrew scriptures were significantly influenced by the Mesopotamian literary tradition, especially during the Babylonian captivity of the 6th century BCE, when the Judean elite was living in Babylon itself and would have had direct access to the great literary and religious traditions of the city. This does not mean that the Hebrew scriptures are merely derivative of Mesopotamian originals. The theological framework is fundamentally different. The Israelite tradition transformed the polytheistic, contractual religion of Mesopotamia into a strictly monotheistic religion with a very different conception of the relationship between God and humanity. But the literary raw materials, the stories, the motifs, the narrative structures, were drawn from the Mesopotamian tradition that surrounded and permeated the ancient Near East for 3,000 years, and recognizing that debt is essential for understanding both the Mesopotamian tradition and the biblical one. The influence of Mesopotamian culture extended far beyond the biblical world. The great civilizations of the Aegean, the Mycenaean civilization of the 2nd millennium BCE, and the Greek civilization that succeeded it, show clear evidence of Mesopotamian cultural influence in their mythology, their architecture, their weights and measures, and their astronomical and mathematical knowledge. The griffin, the sphinx, and other hybrid creatures that populate Greek mythology and art are almost certainly borrowings from the Mesopotamian artistic and mythological tradition, transmitted through Phoenician and other intermediaries. The Greek legend of Heracles and the monster Huowa, the guardian of the cedar forest, echoes the Gilgamesh epic's account of Gilgamesh and Enkidu's journey to the cedar forest and their battle with the monster Humbaba. The comparison of the two stories reveals the Mesopotamian original behind the Greek transformation, and the comparison illuminates both. The Akkadian language, the Semitic language that supplanted Sumerian as the dominant written language of Mesopotamia around 2300 BCE and remained the international language of diplomacy and culture across the ancient Near East for over a millennium, was the vehicle through which Mesopotamian cultural influence spread most broadly. The Amarna archive, discovered in Egypt in 1887, consists of approximately 380 clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform that represent the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV with the rulers of the other great powers of the 14th century BCE, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittite Empire. The use of Akkadian as the common diplomatic language of the ancient Near East is a measure of the cultural prestige of Mesopotamian civilization at its height, comparable to the use of Latin in medieval Europe or English in the contemporary world. The Hittite Empire, the great Anatolian power that rivaled Egypt and Babylon for dominance in the ancient Near East in the 2nd millennium BCE, was itself a major conduit for the transmission of Mesopotamian cultural influence into the wider ancient world. The Hittites adopted the cuneiform script for their own language, absorbed Mesopotamian legal and administrative traditions, and translated Mesopotamian literary texts including the Gilgamesh epic into their own language. The Hittite version of the Gilgamesh epic is one of the most important evidence bases for tracing the story's transmission across the ancient Near East. When the Hittite Empire collapsed around 1200 BCE, part of the general Bronze Age collapse, the Mesopotamian cultural influences it had spread into Anatolia survived in the successor cultures from which classical Greek civilization would eventually develop. The Assyrian Empire, the northern Mesopotamian state that dominated the ancient Near East from approximately 900 to 612 BCE, was the most powerful military force in the world for 3 centuries, and its methods of conquest and administration shaped the political and cultural landscape of the region in ways that are still visible in the historical record. The Assyrians were the heirs of the Mesopotamian urban tradition. They spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language that had been the dominant language of Mesopotamia since the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, and they participated fully in the literary, religious, and scientific traditions that had been developing in the region for thousands of years. But they were also something new, a military state of unprecedented efficiency, organized around the systematic conquest and administration of a vast empire that at its height stretched from Egypt to Iran and from the mountains of Turkey to the Persian Gulf. The Assyrian military machine was the most effective in the ancient world, combining technological innovation, the use of iron weapons and armor, the development of siege engineering, the deployment of cavalry as a separate tactical arm, with organizational innovations, a professional standing army rather than a seasonal levy of farmers, a system of military roads and supply depots that allowed rapid movement across vast distances, and a bureaucratic apparatus capable of administering the conquered territories. The Assyrian practice of deporting conquered populations, relocating the elites and skilled workers of conquered cities to other parts of the empire, replacing them with populations from elsewhere, was both a security measure and an economic one, spreading the skilled craftsmen and administrators of conquered civilizations across the empire and preventing the reassembly of the political networks that might support rebellion. The great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled from approximately 669 to 631 BCE, combined military conquest with intellectual ambition in a way that was unusual among ancient rulers. He established at Nineveh one of the most important libraries in the ancient world, a systematic collection of tablets covering every aspect of Mesopotamian learning, from astronomical observations to medical texts to literary classics. The library of Ashurbanipal is the primary source for our knowledge of Mesopotamian literature, law, and science. The tablets discovered there by 19th-century British archaeologists, now in the British Museum, include the best-preserved version of the Gilgamesh epic, the Enuma Elish, and thousands of other texts that would otherwise be entirely unknown. Ashurbanipal's library was, in this sense, the most consequential act of intellectual conservation in the ancient world, the decision of a conqueror to preserve the accumulated knowledge of the civilization he dominated, and in doing so to ensure its transmission to the modern world. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes was one of the most celebrated events of the ancient world. The city that had been the capital of the greatest empire the world had seen was destroyed with a thoroughness that astonished even those who hated it. The biblical book of Nahum is essentially a celebration of Nineveh's destruction, and the joy expressed in it reflects the depth of hatred that Assyrian imperial brutality had generated among the peoples they had conquered, deported, and subjected to systematic terror. The Assyrian policy of extreme violence, the impalement of rebels, the deportation of entire populations, the destruction of cities that resisted, had been a deliberate policy of intimidation that worked for over 2 centuries, but that ultimately generated the resistance coalition that destroyed the empire. Nineveh was never rebuilt. The city that had housed Ashurbanipal's library and the accumulated knowledge of 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization was abandoned and gradually covered by the silt and debris of the Tigris plain. The tablets of Ashurbanipal's library survived because they were made of clay and baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace that housed them. Many were found in pieces, broken by the collapse of the burning building, but the clay itself preserved the inscriptions even as the building burned around it. When the British archaeologists Austen Henry Layard and his colleague Hormizd Rassam excavated Nineveh in the 1840s and 1850s, they found thousands of tablet fragments, which were shipped to the British Museum and eventually assembled, piece by piece, into the texts that are now among the museum's most important holdings. The accidental preservation of Ashurbanipal's library by the fire that was meant to destroy his palace is one of the great ironies of archaeological history. The act of destruction that ended the Assyrian Empire also inadvertently ensured the survival of the literary tradition that empire had preserved. The influence of the Assyrian Empire on the political traditions of the ancient Near East extended well beyond the specific period of its dominance. The administrative and military techniques the Assyrians developed, the professional army, the system of provincial administration, the network of roads and relay stations, were adopted and adapted by the Persian Empire and through it by the Hellenistic and Roman empires. The Assyrian model of imperial administration was one of the most consequential political inventions of the ancient world, a template for large-scale territorial governance that shaped political organization across Eurasia for over a millennium. The road system, the provincial governor, the standardized weights and measures, the royal post, all trace their genealogy back, through the Persians, to the Assyrian administrative tradition that developed in northern Mesopotamia in the first millennium BCE. The fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire to the Persian king Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE was one of the most peaceful conquests in the history of the ancient world, and it marked the transition from the era of Mesopotamian dominance to the era of Persian dominance in the ancient Near East, a transition that would eventually lead, through the Persian Wars and the conquests of Alexander, to the integration of Mesopotamian civilization into the Hellenistic world. Cyrus's conquest of Babylon was eased by the unpopularity of the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, who had alienated the Babylonian priesthood by replacing the cult of Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, with the cult of the moon god Sin, which he had encountered in his years of residence at the oasis of Tema in Arabia. When Cyrus approached the city, the Babylonian army was defeated in a battle outside the walls, and the city itself surrendered without significant resistance. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscription discovered in 1879 and now among the most famous artifacts in the British Museum, records Cyrus's own account of the conquest. He presents himself as the chosen of Marduk, restoring legitimate religious practice and repatriating the populations and cult statues that Nabonidus had displaced. The cylinder has been described by some modern commentators as the world's first human rights declaration, though historians note that it is better understood as a piece of royal propaganda in the tradition of Mesopotamian royal inscriptions. But it is propaganda of a specific and historically important kind, framing the conqueror's legitimacy in terms of his respect for the religious and cultural traditions of the conquered. The Persian period in Mesopotamia saw the continuation of the great Babylonian cultural and scientific traditions. Babylonian astronomy reached its most sophisticated mathematical development under Persian rule, producing the predictive astronomical system known as mathematical astronomy, a fully mathematical framework for calculating the positions and movements of celestial bodies in advance, without direct observation. That was the most advanced planetary theory in the pre-modern world. The Babylonian astronomical tradition was transmitted to the Greeks through the Persian period, contributing significantly to the development of Greek mathematical astronomy in the Hellenistic period. The names and positions of the zodiacal constellations, the system of planetary omens, the concept of the celestial sphere, all of these were Babylonian contributions to Greek astronomy, transmitted through the cultural exchanges of the Persian and Hellenistic periods. The eventual end of the cuneiform tradition came gradually, over several centuries, as the Aramaic language and alphabetic script, simpler to learn and use than the complex cuneiform system, displaced cuneiform in everyday use. The last known cuneiform astronomical tablet dates to 75 CE, more than 3,000 years after the first cuneiform tablets were inscribed in Uruk. The tradition ended not with a dramatic destruction but with a quiet fade, as the scribes who knew how to read and write cuneiform died without successors, and the tablets they had maintained were sealed in the earth. They waited there, in the dust of the Mesopotamian plain, for nearly 2,000 years, until the archaeologists of the 19th century began to dig them up and the scholars of the Victorian period learned once again to read what they said. The rediscovery of cuneiform and the decipherment of the Mesopotamian languages was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 19th century. The key to the decipherment was the Behistun inscription, carved on a cliff face in western Iran by the Persian king Darius I around 520 BCE, which recorded the same text in three languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, in three different scripts. Henry Rawlinson, a British officer serving with the Persian army in the 1830s and 1840s, risked his life repeatedly to copy the inscription from its nearly inaccessible location on the cliff face, dangling on ropes to transcribe the text from the cliff's vertical surface. His translations of the Old Persian version, using the alphabetic cuneiform script of Old Persian, which was easier to decipher than the syllabic scripts of the other two languages, provided the key for the subsequent decipherment of the Babylonian version. By the 1850s, several scholars working independently had arrived at essentially the same reading of the Babylonian text, and the decipherment was confirmed by the famous test of 1857 in which four scholars, Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, Fox Talbot, and Jules Oppert, independently translated the same newly discovered text and submitted their translations to the Royal Asiatic Society in sealed envelopes. When the envelopes were opened, the translations were in substantial agreement, and the decipherment was accepted as valid. The subsequent century and a half of Assyriology, the scholarly discipline devoted to the study of Mesopotamian civilization through its cuneiform sources, has produced a transformation of our understanding of the ancient world that is still in progress. The texts recovered from the great archive sites of Mesopotamia, from Nippur, Ur, Lagash, Nineveh, Ashur, Mari, and dozens of other sites, have filled in the details of a civilization whose existence was previously known only through the fragmentary references in the Hebrew Bible and the often unreliable accounts of Greek historians. They have given us the world's first literature, the world's first law codes, the world's first systematic astronomy, the world's first financial instruments, and the world's first accounts of the daily lives of ordinary people who lived and worked and argued and loved and died between the Tigris and the Euphrates 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. The legacy of ancient Mesopotamia in the modern world is so pervasive that it is almost invisible, embedded in the structure of our mathematics, our astronomy, our legal systems, our literary traditions, and our religious narratives in ways that we rarely notice because they have become simply part of the background of how we think and live. The 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour that structure our experience of time are Mesopotamian. The 360 degrees of the circle, derived from the Babylonian approximation of the solar year as 360 days, are Mesopotamian. The 12 signs of the zodiac are Mesopotamian. The concept of place value in mathematics, which makes possible all the arithmetic and algebra and calculus that modern science and technology depend on, was first developed in Mesopotamia. The very concept of writing, of using marks on a surface to represent language and preserve it across time and space, was first systematically developed in Mesopotamia. The idea of codified law, of laws written down, publicly proclaimed, and applied consistently to everyone who falls under their jurisdiction, was first systematically developed in Mesopotamia. The institution of credit, of banking, of commercial contracts, of interest on loans, all first appear in the historical record in Mesopotamia. These are not small achievements. Each of them individually would be sufficient to secure a civilization's place in the history of human progress. Together, they represent a transformation of the human condition so comprehensive that it is not an exaggeration to say that the world we live in, the world of cities and writing and law and commerce and systematic knowledge, was fundamentally invented in Mesopotamia. The civilizations that came after it, Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, China, and all their successors, either built directly on the Mesopotamian foundation or developed their own parallel traditions that eventually converged with the Mesopotamian one. There is no civilization of the modern world that is not, in some significant way, the heir of what happened between the rivers. The physical legacy of Mesopotamia is more ambiguous. The great cities of the ancient world, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, Nineveh, are now mounds of eroded mud brick in the landscape of modern Iraq, visited by archaeologists but largely unknown to the wider world. The country that contains these ruins has experienced decades of war, sanctions, and instability that have made systematic archaeological investigation difficult and looting of the sites pervasive. The cultural property of ancient Mesopotamia, the tablets, the seals, the statuary, the architectural remains, has been scattered across museums around the world, and the Great Museum of Baghdad was looted following the American invasion of 2003 in one of the most devastating losses of ancient cultural heritage in modern times. The legacy of Mesopotamia is real and profound. The conditions for studying and preserving that legacy are, at the moment, more difficult than they have been at any time since the rediscovery of the cuneiform tradition in the 19th century. The situation in Iraq has improved somewhat since the worst years of the early 2000s, and archaeological work has resumed at some sites. International teams have returned, new site distributions have been revealed by satellite and drone survey, and some excavations have produced significant results. The process of understanding and preserving the Mesopotamian heritage continues, though at a pace and with resources that fall far short of what the importance of the material warrants. The looting of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad in April 2003 was a catastrophe whose full extent is still being assessed. In the chaos of the initial invasion, looters entered the museum over several days and removed thousands of objects, among them some of the most important artifacts in the world, including the Worka vase, one of the earliest examples of narrative relief sculpture, dating to the Uruk period around 3100 BCE, and the Warka mask, a marble face of extraordinary beauty from the same period. Many of these objects were subsequently recovered, through international law enforcement cooperation and the efforts of dealers and collectors who returned them voluntarily. But many others remain missing, scattered into private collections or destroyed by people who found them impossible to sell. The damage to the museum's archaeological collections, the pottery, the tablets, the small finds that provide the context for understanding the major objects, was even more extensive and far less publicized. The looting of archaeological sites across Iraq in the years following the invasion added a further dimension to the catastrophe. Sites that had never been systematically excavated, that contained potentially transformative evidence about aspects of Mesopotamian civilization still poorly understood, were stripped by looters who sold their finds to dealers and eventually to collectors in Europe, Japan, and the United States. The tablets and cylinder seals that passed through these channels are now scattered across private collections, stripped of the archaeological context that would have made them maximally informative. Some have subsequently surfaced at auction or in museum collections, where they have been identified by scholars and in some cases repatriated to Iraq. But the damage to the archaeological record, the permanent loss of the contextual information that tells us where an object was found, in what layer, in association with what other objects, is irreversible. It is a loss as significant, in its own way, as the burning of a great library. The question of what Mesopotamia can tell us about civilization itself, not just about one specific ancient civilization, but about the nature of the social and institutional forms that human beings have repeatedly invented and reinvented across different times and places, is one that historians and social scientists have been exploring since the rediscovery of cuneiform. Mesopotamia was not the only place where complex urban civilization developed independently. The other primary cases, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, each developed their own distinctive forms of urban life, their own writing systems, their own legal and religious traditions, their own technological and scientific achievements. The comparison of these independently developed civilizations is one of the most productive intellectual exercises in the history of the social sciences, because it allows us to distinguish the features of civilization that are universal, that appear in every case of complex social organization, from those that are historically specific to particular traditions. The universal features are striking. In every independently developed urban civilization, we find the same basic combination: surplus agriculture capable of feeding a non-agricultural population, a hierarchical social structure with an elite that controls the surplus, an administrative system that tracks and redistributes the surplus, some form of symbolic communication that supports the administration, monumental architecture that expresses the power and the legitimacy of the elite, and a religious system that provides a cosmological framework within which the social hierarchy is naturalized and sanctified. These features appear so consistently across independently developed civilizations that they are plausibly understood as the minimum conditions for urban social complexity, the toolkit that every large, complex society needs in some form to function. Mesopotamia was the first civilization to develop this toolkit, and it did so in a specific ecological and historical context that shaped the specific forms the toolkit took. The irrigation agriculture of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta produced the surplus. The need to administer the irrigation system produced the administrative hierarchy. The need to track the surplus produced writing. The great temples that dominated the Sumerian cities expressed both the religious authority that legitimized the hierarchy and the economic power that sustained it. The law codes that Hammurabi and his predecessors compiled expressed the attempt to regularize and stabilize the relationships within a complex society. Each element of the Mesopotamian toolkit responded to a specific problem posed by the challenge of organizing large numbers of people in a productive and stable social system, and the solutions that the Mesopotamians found to those problems were so effective that they became the foundations on which every subsequent civilization was built. The question of why civilization first appeared in Mesopotamia, rather than somewhere else with comparable agricultural potential, has been debated by historians and archaeologists for over a century, and it has not been definitively answered. The Nile Valley was as fertile as the Tigris-Euphrates Delta, and Egyptian civilization developed independently and at approximately the same time. The Indus Valley was also fertile and also developed urban civilization in the 3rd millennium BCE, independently of both Mesopotamia and Egypt. China's Yellow River Valley developed its own urban civilization in the 2nd millennium BCE. The factors that produced urban civilization in these specific locations appear to be a combination of agricultural potential, population density, and the specific social and institutional innovations that allowed the translation of agricultural surplus into social complexity, and those innovations, in each case, appear to have been genuine local inventions rather than imports from elsewhere. What made Mesopotamia specifically important was not that it was the only place where civilization could have appeared. The parallel developments in Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China demonstrate that it was not, but that it appeared there first and that the particular forms it took in Mesopotamia were subsequently disseminated across the ancient Near East and beyond with a thoroughness and a persistence that gave them a disproportionate influence on subsequent world history. The specific forms of writing, law, astronomy, and commerce that the Mesopotamians developed became the templates for the development of those institutions across a vast geographic area. And through the ancient Near East they influenced the Greco-Roman world, and through the Greco-Roman world they influenced the modern world. Mesopotamia's priority was real, and its influence was immense, and the combination of those two facts justifies the claim that it was, in the most important sense, the civilization that invented the world we live in. The question of where the objects of ancient Mesopotamia belong, whether in the European and North American museums that have housed them for a century and a half or in Iraq, has become increasingly contested. The argument for Western museums emphasizes safety, scholarly accessibility, and the investment in study and interpretation. The argument for repatriation emphasizes cultural significance, the circumstances of acquisition, often involving the same colonial dynamics that produced modern instability, and the principle that objects belong to the cultures that created them. The debate is ongoing and unlikely to be resolved soon. But it is a debate that Mesopotamia, by the scale of what it left behind, is uniquely positioned to shape, and its resolution will say something important about how the modern world values and manages its relationship to the most ancient chapters of the human story. The archaeology of ancient Mesopotamia has been transformed in the past century by the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for recovering and interpreting the material remains of the civilization, and the picture that has emerged from this work is richer, more complex, and in many respects more surprising than the version of Mesopotamian history that was constructed in the 19th century. The cuneiform tablets are the most important primary source for Mesopotamian history, and the sheer quantity of surviving tablets is extraordinary. Estimates of the total number of tablets that have been excavated range from 500,000 to over 1 million, and most of them have never been fully published or translated. The tablets cover every aspect of Mesopotamian life: administrative records of the great temples and palaces, private contracts and letters, legal cases and their outcomes, astronomical observations and predictions, medical recipes and diagnoses, hymns and prayers, myths and epics, school exercises and mathematical problems. Together they constitute one of the richest archives of ancient human activity anywhere in the world, and they allow a degree of insight into the daily life of ancient Mesopotamia that is simply not available for most other ancient civilizations. The tablets reveal, among many other things, that ancient Mesopotamian society was far more open and dynamic than the hierarchical model of a priest-king ruling over passive subjects might suggest. Private individuals bought and sold property, entered into complex commercial partnerships, went to court to defend their rights, wrote letters to absent family members, complained about the quality of the copper they had received in a commercial transaction, and negotiated with the institutions of the state about the terms of the obligations they owed. The archive of the Assyrian merchant community at Kanesh in Anatolia, a colony of Assyrian traders who maintained commercial relationships with their home city of Ashur for over a century in the early 2nd millennium BCE, reveals a world of commercial activity organized around networks of trust, credit, and information that would not be out of place in a modern business environment. The merchants kept detailed accounts, wrote letters to their business partners and families, organized joint ventures, sued each other in court when disputes arose, and maintained a commercial culture of considerable sophistication across a distance of over 1,000 kilometers. The private lives of ordinary Mesopotamians are visible in the tablets in ways that are sometimes startling in their immediacy. A husband writing to his wife about a business matter and asking her to send him a pair of sandals. A merchant complaining bitterly to a supplier that the copper ingots he had paid for were of inferior quality, and threatening legal action if the matter was not remedied. This letter, the famous Old Assyrian complaint letter known as the Nasir tablet, is sometimes cited as the oldest known customer complaint in history. A student writing out multiplication tables as a school exercise, making the same small errors that students make today. These glimpses of ancient ordinary life are one of the most compelling aspects of the Mesopotamian record, and they remind us that the civilization we are studying was not merely an institutional structure, but a world of individual human beings living their lives with the same mixture of practicality, anxiety, ambition, and humor that characterizes human life in every age. The medical tradition of ancient Mesopotamia is another dimension of this intimate record. Medical texts from Mesopotamia include both the omen-based diagnostic tradition, in which the physician interpreted the patient's symptoms as omens indicating the involvement of specific supernatural forces and prescribed rituals accordingly, and a more practical empirical tradition of herbal and physical remedies that reads much closer to what we would recognize as medicine. The distinction between the two traditions was not as sharp in the ancient world as it might seem to us. The Mesopotamian worldview did not separate natural and supernatural causation in the way that modern Western medicine does, and the prescription of both ritual and herbal remedy for the same condition was entirely consistent within the Mesopotamian medical framework. The recipes for beer and bread that appear in Mesopotamian administrative and literary texts are among the most charming aspects of the record. Beer was the most important beverage of ancient Mesopotamia, safer to drink than the river water, nutritionally significant, and socially central. The hymn to the goddess Ninkasi, the divine brewer, is both a religious text and a practical recipe for the production of several kinds of beer, embedded in a mythological framework that treats the art of brewing as a divine gift. The Sumerians drank their beer through long reed straws inserted into large communal jars, and the image of groups of people drinking beer together around a large vessel is one of the most frequently depicted scenes in Mesopotamian art, suggesting that communal beer drinking was as central to Mesopotamian social life as communal dining is to our own. The world's first known brewery operated in Uruk around 3400 BCE, producing beer at industrial scale for distribution to the city's workforce. The workers who built the great temples were paid in beer and bread, the primary staples of the Mesopotamian diet, and the administrative records tracking these distributions are among the earliest cuneiform texts. The invention of writing to record beer rations is one of the more charming facts about the origins of literacy. Humanity's most transformative intellectual technology was first deployed in the service of tracking who had received their daily ration of fermented grain. The civilization that rose between the Tigris and the Euphrates 6,000 years ago did not last forever. Nothing does. The long history of Mesopotamia is a history of rise and fall, of empire and collapse, of cities built and rebuilt and abandoned, of traditions maintained through catastrophe and eventually lost to the slow erosion of cultural change. The last cuneiform tablet was written in 75 CE, in a Babylonian astronomical observatory that had been maintaining its records continuously for 3,000 years. The scribes who wrote it knew they were among the last practitioners of a tradition that had already been in decline for centuries, as Aramaic and then Greek and then Parthian supplanted cuneiform as the written languages of the region. They wrote it anyway, because the tradition demanded it, and because the observation of the sky that it recorded had been recorded every day, by scribes in unbroken succession, since before the time of Hammurabi. And then they stopped, and the tradition ended, and the tablets were sealed in the earth. 2,000 years later, the tablets were found. The cuneiform was deciphered. The records were read. The flood story was recognized as the ancestor of the biblical narrative. The mathematical tablets were analyzed and found to contain knowledge that Western mathematics had not rediscovered until the 17th century. The astronomical records were used by modern scientists to recalibrate the movements of the planets over the past 3,000 years. The legal codes were compared with the laws of Moses and found to share so many specific features that the comparison transformed the understanding of the origins of the biblical legal tradition. The Gilgamesh epic was read and found to be not merely a curiosity but a genuine literary masterpiece, exploring the themes of friendship, loss, mortality, and the search for meaning with a sophistication and a depth that has not been surpassed in the 4,000 years since it was composed. What the civilization of ancient Mesopotamia ultimately gave to the world was not specific inventions or specific institutions, though those were extraordinary enough. It was the demonstration that human beings could organize themselves in complex, literate, legally governed, commercially sophisticated, scientifically curious societies. That demonstration was made first between the rivers, and every subsequent civilization that has made the same demonstration has been, in some fundamental sense, following in the tracks that the people of Sumer and Babylon left in the alluvial mud of the Tigris-Euphrates delta. The wheel was invented there. Writing was invented there. Law was invented there. And most fundamentally, civilization itself, the organized, literate, legally governed, commercially sophisticated form of human social life that we still inhabit, was invented there, by people whose names are mostly forgotten, whose language is no longer spoken, whose cities are now mounds of eroded mud brick in the landscape of a troubled country. They invented the world we live in. And we are only now, after centuries of work, beginning to understand the full scale of what they achieved. The students who sit in mathematics classrooms around the world and learn to calculate in base 10 do not know that the division of their hours into 60 minutes comes from Babylon. The lawyers who argue in courtrooms from Seoul to Sao Paulo do not know that the concept of written law publicly proclaimed and consistently applied was first worked out in the palace of Hammurabi. The astronomers who map the sky using the 12 constellations of the zodiac do not know that those constellations were defined by Babylonian priests observing the sky from the tops of ziggurats along the Euphrates. The readers who open the book of Genesis and read of the flood that destroyed all life do not always know that the story was first told in Sumerian, 4,000 years ago, in a language that is no longer spoken by anyone living. This is not a complaint about ingratitude. Civilization works by building on what came before without necessarily acknowledging the foundation, by incorporating the achievements of the past so thoroughly into the background of the present that they become invisible, simply part of how the world is. The invisibility of Mesopotamia in our cultural consciousness is a measure of how completely its achievements have been absorbed. The Sumerians would not have expected gratitude from us, any more than the anonymous artisan who first shaped a wheel expected that the descendants of the people who rode in wheeled vehicles would remember his name. The achievement matters more than the credit. What does matter, what the study of Mesopotamia gives us, is perspective. The perspective of deep time, revealing how recently the forms of life we take for granted were invented. The perspective of human possibility, revealing how far the Sumerians traveled in a few centuries from nothing but a fertile plain and their own ingenuity toward the complex, literate, legally governed civilization we still inhabit. And the perspective of loss, of what is gone and cannot be recovered, of 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge that faded with the last cuneiform scribe, sealed in clay tablets that are only partially recovered by the scholars who spend their lives learning to read what the people of the Tigris-Euphrates plain left in the earth for us to find. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more civilizations that changed everything, more moments when the world as we know it was assembled from ideas that did not previously exist, more stories of the people who built what we inherited without knowing they were building for us. A new documentary every week, always in the hours designed for rest, always going further than you expect.